He stood completely alone in that cemetery, dressed in black, staring at a coffin that held the only person who knew the entire truth. The funeral was supposed to be crowded with business associates, family friends, investors who owed their fortunes to the Marchetti name. Instead, there were maybe 15 people scattered across the cemetery, most of them employees paid to attend. The gravediggers waited at a distance, indifferent to his grief. And that's when she appeared. Before we start this story, I need you to do something for me. Leave a comment below telling me what city you're watching from right now. I genuinely want to know where my audience is. And at the very end of the story, I need you to rate it from 0 to 10. Because this is not just a story about money and lies. This is a story about what happens when the foundation of your entire life gets pulled out from under you in exactly 45 seconds. This is the story of Alessandro Marchetti, the man everyone thought had everything, and the woman who walked into his life carrying the one secret that could destroy him completely. The Marchetti family had been building wealth for 137 years. 137 years of careful decisions, strategic marriages, calculated risks, and ruthless business practices that had accumulated into a fortune estimated at somewhere between 2 and 3 billion euros. Nobody knew the exact amount. The number changed depending on market conditions, property values, and which assets the family was currently liquidating. Alessandro's father, Vittorio Marchetti, had been the architect of most of that modern wealth. He'd taken what his grandfather had built and transformed it into something that touched multiple industries. Real estate, technology, luxury goods, banking. The Marchetti name was synonymous with Italian power and continental influence. Vittorio had also been ruthless, calculated, cold in a way that Alessandro had never managed to become, no matter how hard he tried. Alessandro was 35 years old when his father died. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd inherited his father's bone structure but not his father's capacity for cruelty. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, but they held something his father's never had, a capacity for doubt. He wore expensive suits, always perfectly tailored, always in muted colors like charcoal or navy or black. His watch was worth more than most people's houses. His shoes were handmade Italian leather. Everything about him screamed money, but underneath that carefully constructed exterior was a man who'd spent his entire adult life wondering if any of it was real. He'd gone to the right schools. Oxford, the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. He'd worked at the right companies before returning to the family business. He'd made the right investments. He'd been photographed at the right events with the right people. He'd done everything he was supposed to do. But somewhere along the way, Alessandro had started having dreams. Bad dreams. Dreams where he walked into the office and discovered that everything was built on paperwork that didn't exist. That the money wasn't real. That his entire identity was constructed from nothing but air and ambition, and the kind of lies that successful people tell themselves to sleep at night. The dreams had gotten worse in the 6 months before his father died. More specific. More detailed. In one recurring dream, his father's face would turn toward him and he would say, "The truth is coming, Alessandro. And when it does, you won't recognize yourself anymore." Alessandro had mentioned the dreams to his therapist, who'd suggested that they were manifestations of normal anxieties about succession and responsibility. She'd recommended meditation and medication. He'd tried both. The dreams persisted. Then Vittorio had the heart attack. It was sudden. One moment he was in a business meeting in Milan. The next moment he was on the floor and the paramedics were arriving too late. His father had been dead for 3 days before Alessandro managed to comprehend that the man was actually gone. 3 days of his brain refusing to accept the permanence of it. 3 days of expecting phone calls that would never come, expecting his father to emerge from wherever he'd gone and tell him he'd been joking. The funeral was held at a small church in Turin on a gray afternoon that matched Alessandro's internal landscape perfectly. The sky was the color of wet cement. The wind smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. The cemetery was on a hill overlooking the city, and from where Alessandro stood, he could see the lights of Turin beginning to twinkle as the afternoon faded toward evening. His mother wasn't there. She was in Switzerland in a private hospital, being treated for what the family called exhaustion. but what was actually a nervous breakdown that had been happening slowly for the past 10 years. His sister was in London with her husband and children, and she'd sent a representative instead of coming herself. A representative. As if his father's funeral was a corporate event that could be delegated. So Alessandro stood alone, holding a single red rose that the funeral director had given him, and watched as his father's coffin was lowered into the ground. He waited for grief to arrive. He waited for it to hit him like a wave. He waited for tears. But what arrived instead was something else entirely. What arrived was a profound sense of relief. And then, immediately following that relief, a crushing sense of guilt for feeling relieved. His father had been a difficult man, but he had been his father. And now he was gone. The service ended. The mourners dispersed slowly, most of them checking their phones before they'd even left the cemetery. The priest said something sympathetic that Alessandro didn't hear. He was staring at the grave, at the place where his father's body was being covered with dirt, and he was thinking about all the conversations they'd never had. All the times his father had told him to focus on business instead of asking questions about where the money came from. All the times he'd said, "Don't think about the mechanisms, Alessandro. Just think about the results." That's when he felt her hand on his shoulder. He turned, and for a moment he couldn't place her. She was a woman, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a black dress that was elegant but clearly not expensive. Her shoes were practical, black flats that looked like they'd been worn many times. Her face was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or styling. It was the kind of beauty that comes from intelligence and intensity and something else he couldn't quite name. Her eyes were gray-green, and they were looking at him with an expression of profound sadness. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said in Italian, her accent suggesting she wasn't Italian originally, though she spoke the language fluently. Alessandro nodded because it was what you were supposed to do when someone said that. But he was studying her face, trying to figure out who she was. She wasn't family. She wasn't a family friend. She wasn't anyone he recognized. "Thank you," he said formally. "Did you know my father?" The woman hesitated. For just a moment, something shifted in her expression. It was a very small shift, barely perceptible, but Alessandro had spent his entire life learning to notice small shifts in people's expressions. It was a survival skill in the world of business. "Not the way you mean," she said quietly. She glanced around at the remaining mourners, at the priests and the funeral directors, at the gravediggers waiting to finish their work. Then she leaned closer, and she whispered something into his ear that would change everything. "Your fortune is built on something that isn't real, Alessandro. And I have proof." He pulled back, his face showing confusion and something else, something that looked like fear. "Who are you?" he asked, but when he turned to look at her again, she was already walking away. She moved through the cemetery with purpose, toward a car parked at the far end near the gate. He watched her go, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He wanted to call after her. He wanted to run after her. Instead, he stood there, holding the red rose, and watched as she drove away. That night, Alessandro sat in his father's office in the family villa. It was a room that felt like it belonged to someone else, even though it had been his father's for 40 years. The walls were lined with books that nobody had ever read. The desk was made of mahogany from somewhere in South America. The carpet was Persian. The paintings were by artists whose names Alessandro could never remember. He sat in his father's chair and opened his father's computer, using the password he'd discovered years ago hidden in his father's personal notebook. What he found made him understand that the woman at the cemetery had been telling the truth. The emails were carefully hidden in a folder labeled Gardening Correspondence, which was such a cliché cover that Alessandro almost laughed. But inside that folder was the entire mechanism of his family's wealth, laid out in correspondence spanning 30 years. And almost none of it was real. The property holdings that formed the foundation of the Marchetti fortune didn't actually exist. They existed on paper, created through shell companies and fraudulent registrations. The technology company that had been the source of millions in venture capital had never actually developed any technology. It was a money laundering operation disguised as innovation. The banking interests that had seemed so legitimate were based on falsified documents and embezzled funds that had been cleverly rerouted so many times that they'd become almost impossible to trace. What made it brilliant, Alessandro realized as he kept reading, was the timing. His grandfather had created the initial structure in the 1950s when records were harder to verify and international banking laws were less stringent. By the time anyone could have proven that the foundation was fraudulent, the money had moved so many times and been laundered through so many legitimate channels that it had become indistinguishable from real wealth. The Marchetti fortune had been built not on business acumen, but on an elaborate system of criminal activity that had been perfected over almost a century. And his father had inherited this system. Not knowing how it was built would have been impossible. His father had been too intelligent, too meticulous, too involved in every financial decision. Vittorio Marchetti had not only known that the family's fortune was built on fraud. He had spent his life protecting that fraud and expanding it. Alessandro closed the computer and sat in the darkness of his father's office. He was trying to understand what this meant. The money in his bank accounts was stolen. The properties he'd been planning to develop were fraudulently registered. The reputation he'd been carefully building in the legitimate business world was built on a foundation of lies and crime. Everything about him was based on something that wasn't real. He thought about the woman at the cemetery. She had known this. She had walked up to him while his father's body was still being lowered into the ground and she had told him the truth. But how did she know? Who was she? And what did she want? He pulled out his phone and did something he'd never thought to do before. He searched for information about his father's affairs. Not his romantic affairs, but his business affairs. Every business his father had been involved with, every company he'd created, every deal he'd made. Then he started looking for patterns. Looking for names. Looking for anyone who might have been close enough to his father to know the truth. That's when he found the connection. A woman named Giulia Rinaldi. She appeared in documents from 15 years ago. She'd been listed as a consultant on several projects. Then she'd disappeared from the records. But her signature appeared on documents that were clearly fraudulent. Her name was on the paperwork that created one of the shell companies that formed the basis of the Marchetti wealth. He searched for Giulia Rinaldi on social media. There were thousands of people with that name, but there was one whose profile picture matched the woman from the cemetery. Her current job was listed as an investigative journalist. Her bio said, "Uncovering the stories that powerful people don't want told." Alessandro stared at her profile for a long time. Then he did something that probably wasn't smart. He sent her a message. Just 3 words. "Who are you?" The response came 40 minutes later. "Someone who used to work for your father. Someone who helped build the system that made your family rich. Someone who realized that making other people rich through crime was destroying my own soul." Then she sent him an address. An apartment in Turin. And a time. Midnight. She wrote, "If you want to know the truth about everything, come alone. But be prepared for the fact that knowing the truth might be worse than not knowing it." Alessandro didn't go to sleep that night. He spent the hours between receiving the message and midnight walking through the villa, looking at all the things his money had bought and understanding that none of it was real. The paintings were beautiful, but they were purchased with stolen money. The furniture was elegant, but it was paid for with fraudulent funds. Even his own reflection in the mirror felt like a lie. At 11:45, he left the villa and drove toward the address she'd given him. It was in a neighborhood that he'd never been to, a part of Turin where ordinary people lived. Where architects and teachers and engineers and nurses lived. Not where billionaires lived. Not where people surrounded by fraud lived. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that didn't have a doorman. He climbed the stairs and knocked on the door at midnight exactly. When she opened it, he understood that everything was about to change. "My name is Giulia Rinaldi," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "And I'm going to tell you a story that your father spent his entire life trying to hide. A story about how a brilliant young woman named Giulia made a terrible mistake by trusting a charming man named Vittorio Marchetti. A story about how that mistake cost her 30 years of her life and will probably cost you everything you think you know about yourself. Are you ready to hear it?" Alessandro nodded because he had no choice. Because the moment the woman had whispered in his ear at his father's funeral, his old life had ended. Now he just had to find out what his new life was going to be. Giulia's apartment was small, maybe 40 square meters, with windows overlooking a quiet street. There was no art on the walls. No expensive furniture. Just books. Thousands of books. And photographs. Photographs of documents. Photographs of signatures. Photographs of Giulia, years younger, standing next to his father at events he'd never seen documented anywhere else. "I met your father when I was 22 years old," Giulia began, and as she told her story, Alessandro understood that the comfortable life he'd been living was over. That the fortune he'd inherited was poison. That everything about him was a lie that was about to be exposed. And that the only person who could help him survive what was coming was the woman who had infiltrated his father's world 30 years ago and who had spent the last 3 decades gathering evidence of crimes that would destroy not just the Marchetti family, but possibly the entire financial infrastructure that powerful families like his had been using to hide their stolen wealth. She handed him a folder. Inside were documents that would, within weeks, become the subject of the largest financial fraud investigation in Italian history. Inside were the names of every person his father had worked with, every politician he'd bribed, every official he'd paid off, every crime that had been committed. And at the bottom of the stack, there was a letter in his father's handwriting. It was addressed to Alessandro. It said, "If you're reading this, then Giulia has already found you. If she hasn't, she will. Because Giulia is the only person who was ever brave enough to walk away from me. She's the only person who understood that having everything built on lies is the same as having nothing at all. She's the only person who could see that I was destroying myself and everyone around me by living in a world of fraud. If you want to save yourself, Alessandro, you need to listen to her. You need to do the thing I was never brave enough to do. You need to tell the truth. You need to give back what was stolen. You need to become a different person than I was. And if you can do that, if you can find the courage to destroy everything I built and build something real instead, then maybe you can save yourself from becoming me." That's what it said. In his father's own handwriting. A confession. A plea. And an instruction. So Alessandro made a choice. A choice that would cost him everything. A choice that would take years to unwind. A choice that would transform him from a billionaire into a man who had nothing, which is exactly what he needed to become. He and Giulia spent the next 72 hours gathering every piece of evidence, every document, every photograph that proved the extent of the fraud. Then they walked into the office of the federal prosecutor in Turin and they handed over everything. What happened next made international news. The Marchetti family was exposed as having perpetrated one of the largest financial frauds in European history. Accounts were frozen. Assets were seized. Investigations were opened not just into the Marchetti family, but into dozens of other wealthy families who'd been using the same mechanisms to hide their stolen wealth. Alessandro's mother had to leave Switzerland and return to face charges as an accomplice. His sister's husband's business empire collapsed when it was revealed that he'd been using Marchetti-controlled shell companies for decades. But Alessandro survived. More than that, he transformed. He worked with prosecutors. He testified against business associates who'd known what was happening. He spent years untangling the criminal network his father had created. And slowly, carefully, he built a new life. Not as a billionaire, but as someone who was actually real. 2 years after his father's funeral, Alessandro and Giulia were having dinner at a small restaurant in Turin when he finally asked her the question that had been sitting between them since that night in her apartment. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "Why did you spend 30 years gathering evidence against my father instead of just turning him in? Why did you wait until he was dead to come to me?" Giulia looked at him across the table. "Because your father was very smart," she said. "He would have destroyed any evidence I brought forward. He would have made me disappear. He would have rewritten history so completely that nobody would have ever believed me. But I also did it because I was waiting for you. I was waiting for you to be old enough to understand the choice you'd have to make. Because I knew that eventually, you'd have to choose between becoming your father and becoming someone different. And I wanted to give you that choice when you could actually understand what it meant. And if I'd chosen the other way? Alessandro asked. If I'd chosen to protect the fraud? To continue it? Julia looked at him across the table. Because your father was very smart, she said. He would have destroyed any evidence I brought forward. He would have made me disappear. He would have rewritten history so completely that nobody would have ever believed me. But I also did it because I was waiting for you. I was waiting for you to be old enough to understand the choice you'd have to make. Because I knew that eventually, you'd have to choose between becoming your father and becoming someone different. And I wanted to give you that choice when you could actually understand what it meant. And if I'd chosen the other way? Alessandro repeated, his voice quieter this time. If I'd chosen to protect the fraud? To continue it? Julia set down her wine glass slowly. She took a long time before answering. Outside the restaurant window, Turin was glowing in the evening light. The city looked beautiful, unchanged, indifferent to the conversation happening inside this small room. Then I would have released everything to the press, Julia said finally. But it wouldn't have just been the documents, Alessandro. It would have been everything. Your entire life laid bare. The women you'd slept with who were connected to business associates. The bribes your mother had taken. The money your sister's husband had laundered through Marchetti accounts. Every single person in your family circle would have been exposed. The investigation would have taken 5 years instead of 2. Your mother would have spent 10 years in prison instead of 4. Your sister's children would have grown up knowing that their father was a criminal. And you would have spent the rest of your life fighting prosecutors, paying legal fees, watching your reputation disintegrate piece by piece while you tried to hold on to money that was never yours in the first place. Alessandro listened without interrupting. He understood what she was saying, but he also understood something deeper. He understood that Julia had spent 30 years carrying the weight of knowing what his father had done, and that the burden of that knowledge had shaped every decision she'd made. How did you even survive it? He asked. Knowing what you knew. Working for him all those years. Julia's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. I didn't survive, she said. Not really. I just learned how to function while being destroyed from the inside. Do you know what your father used to tell me? He used to say that I was too sensitive. That if I wanted to succeed in business, I needed to develop a thicker skin. That morality was a luxury that only poor people could afford. He would say it so casually, while he was stealing money that was supposed to go to people's pensions, while he was bribing officials who were supposed to be protecting the public interest, while he was destroying lives because he wanted another property on Lake Como. She paused, looking down at her plate. The food in front of her had gone cold. She hadn't touched it. I stayed for 3 reasons, she continued. The first reason was that I was young and I didn't understand what was happening. By the time I understood, I was already implicated. Your father had made sure of that. He'd put my signature on documents. He'd made me a part of the system. So the second reason I stayed was fear. If I left, he would have destroyed me. He would have claimed that I was the architect of the fraud. He would have made sure I went to prison while he walked free. So I stayed and I gathered evidence. I built a case. I took photographs of every document. I memorized every conversation. I became a ghost inside his organization, invisible but present, recording everything. And the third reason? Alessandro asked. The third reason, Julia said, meeting his eyes directly, was you. Because I could see it even when you were young. I could see that you were fundamentally different from your father. I could see that the lies were already eating you alive. I could see the moment when you'd have to choose, and I wanted to be there to help you make the right choice. I wanted you to understand that there was another way, that it wasn't too late to become someone real. Alessandro felt something break inside his chest. Not in a painful way, but in the way that a dam breaks and releases water that's been building pressure for years. But I almost didn't choose the right way, he said quietly. You know that, right? When I first read those documents, my first instinct was to destroy them. My first thought was about how much I would lose. The houses. The accounts. The status. The identity. Everything I'd built my life around. I spent 2 days seriously considering ways I could cover it up. Ways I could blame it on a lower-level employee. Ways I could restructure the accounts so that the fraud was technically legal. I spent 2 days thinking like my father. Julia nodded. She already knew this. She'd known it because she'd been watching him. She'd been watching to see if he would become his father, or if he would choose to become something else. "What changed your mind?" she asked. "I had a dream," Alessandro said. "The same dream I'd been having for years, but this time it was different. In the dream, my father and I were standing in that cemetery, and my body was in the coffin. And he was reading my eulogy. And he was saying that I had lived a life of excellence and distinction. That I had built an empire. That I had everything a man could want. But his voice was empty. His eyes were empty. And in the dream, I understood that I was dead. Not physically dead, but dead in every way that mattered. I was dead inside because I had become him. Because I had chosen the lies instead of the truth." He stopped speaking and looked out the window at the city. "When I woke up from that dream, I called you. And I said yes. And I meant it. I meant it completely." Julia reached across the table and took his hand. "I know you did," she said. "That's why I knew you would choose correctly. Because you were capable of understanding what the cost of the other choice would actually be." But the conversation didn't end there. Because Alessandro had another question. And this question was darker. This question had been sitting beneath the surface of everything since the moment Julia had walked away from his father's funeral. "What if I hadn't understood?" he asked. "What if I'd been a different person? What if I'd decided to continue the fraud, and you'd released everything to the press, and I'd gone to prison instead? Would you have still felt like you'd done the right thing?" Julia was quiet for a very long time. So long that Alessandro thought she might not answer. But finally, she said something that revealed a part of her that she'd never shown to anyone. "No," she said. "I would have destroyed you knowing it was wrong. I would have done it because I was broken. Because for 30 years, I'd been carrying the weight of your father's crimes as if they were my own crimes. Because I'd convinced myself that the only way to heal from what he'd done to me was to ruin his family. And that's the truth, Alessandro. That's the ugly truth that I've never told anyone. If you'd chosen differently, I would have released the documents not because justice demanded it, but because my rage demanded it. Because I would have wanted revenge more than I would have wanted mercy." Alessandro absorbed this. He understood what it cost her to say it. He understood that Julia had spent 30 years being destroyed by her association with his father, and that the only thing that had kept her alive was the possibility that his father's son might choose differently. "But you didn't release them," Alessandro said. "You gave me the choice." "I gave you the choice because I was hoping you would save me," Julia said. "I was hoping that if you chose the truth, if you chose honesty, if you chose to become something real, then maybe I could become real again too. Maybe I could stop being the woman who worked for a criminal and start being the woman I could have been if I'd made different choices when I was 22 years old." And that's when Alessandro understood the full depth of what Julia had sacrificed. She hadn't just spent 30 years gathering evidence. She'd spent 30 years living a double life. She'd spent 30 years pretending to be someone she wasn't so that she could have access to the truth. She'd spent 30 years being invisible, being complicit, being destroyed, all in hopes that one day, someone would choose to be real. The investigation that followed Alessandro's decision to cooperate with prosecutors was even more complex than anyone had anticipated. Because it turned out that the Marchetti family wasn't operating alone. They were part of a larger network of wealthy families and powerful individuals who'd been using similar mechanisms to hide billions of euros. Once prosecutors started pulling the thread of the Marchetti fraud, the entire structure began to unravel. Within 6 months, the investigation had expanded to include 3 other major Italian families. Within a year, it had crossed borders and implicated individuals in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the United States. The amount of stolen wealth that was eventually recovered exceeded 5 billion euros. It was the largest financial fraud investigation in Italian history, and at the center of it was Alessandro Marchetti, the billionaire who'd chosen to destroy his own family's empire. But the cost was higher than anyone had calculated. Alessandro's mother, when confronted with the evidence, had a severe mental breakdown. The charges against her were eventually reduced due to her mental health status, but she spent the rest of her life in a psychiatric facility, unable to accept that her husband had been a criminal and that her son had destroyed her life. His sister's husband was arrested and convicted. He served 7 years in prison. When he was released, his marriage had disintegrated and his children barely spoke to him. Alessandro's sister eventually moved to Australia with the children, and Alessandro didn't hear from her again for 5 years. The extended family, the cousins and aunts and uncles who'd been living comfortable lives funded by stolen money, had to rebuild everything from scratch. Some of them hated Alessandro for exposing the fraud. Some of them eventually thanked him for forcing them to become real. But the hardest part was what happened to Alessandro internally. Because even though he'd made the right choice, the consequences of that choice nearly destroyed him. He had to live in a small apartment while the investigations continued. He couldn't work in banking or finance because his involvement, even though he'd been cooperating with authorities, had made him toxic to every legitimate financial institution. He lived on his modest salary as a consultant to prosecutors, which was less than 1% of what he'd been earning before. He lost friends who'd only been friends because of his money. He was invited to leave clubs he'd been a member of for 15 years. People crossed the street to avoid him. He received hate mail from individuals in organized crime who'd lost money because of the investigation. He required security for 2 years because there were legitimate threats against his life. And worst of all, he had to live with the fact that his choice had cost his family everything. That every day, his mother sat in a psychiatric facility unable to understand why her life had been destroyed. That every day, his sister's children went to school in Australia with the knowledge that their father was a criminal. That every day, extended family members struggled with the fact that the comfortable lives they'd been living had been built on fraud. There was a period, about 9 months after the investigation became public, when Alessandro seriously considered suicide. He stood on the balcony of his small apartment overlooking Turin, and he seriously considered whether it would be better to end his life than to continue living with the consequences of his choice. It was Giulia who saved him. Not by saying anything profound. Not by reminding him that he'd done the right thing. But simply by sitting with him. By holding his hand. By being present in his darkness without trying to fix it. "This is the cost," she said quietly, when he finally told her what he'd been thinking. "This is what it costs to choose the truth when the lie is so much more comfortable. This is what integrity means. It means losing everything. It means being destroyed. It means standing in the wreckage of your own life and having to figure out how to rebuild something real from nothing." "How do you do it?" Alessandro asked. "How do you live with the knowledge that you've destroyed people? That your mother will never be the same? That your sister's children will spend their entire lives in Australia because of what you did?" "You don't get over it," Giulia said. "You learn to live with it. You wake up every day and you acknowledge that it's hard. You acknowledge that the cost was real. And you spend the rest of your life making sure that the choice you made means something. That it wasn't just destruction for the sake of destruction. That it actually leads somewhere better." Alessandro sat with those words for a long moment. He was standing on the balcony of their small apartment in Turin, looking out at the city lights. Giulia was beside him, her hand in his, her presence grounding him to something real in a way that nothing else could. "I don't know if I can do this," he said quietly. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to live with this for the rest of my life." "You don't have to be strong," Giulia said. "You just have to be willing. You have to be willing to wake up every morning and choose again and again to keep going. To keep working. To keep believing that it means something. Some days that's going to feel impossible. Some days you're going to want to give up. Some days you're going to hate me for introducing you to the truth. But you do it anyway. Because the alternative is worse." That night, Alessandro didn't sleep. He walked through the apartment that was now his entire world. The small kitchen where they made simple meals together. The bedroom where he'd held Giulia while she had nightmares about his father. The living room filled with books and documents and the evidence of their work. This was what he had instead of billions of euros. This was what he had instead of villas on Lake Como and penthouse apartments in Milan. And as he walked through those small rooms, Alessandro began to understand something that would take him years to fully grasp. He began to understand that the loss was real, but so was the gain. That he'd lost money and status and comfort, but he'd gained something that those things could never buy. He'd gained the possibility of being real. He'd gained the possibility of building something with another person that wasn't based on lies. He'd gained the possibility of looking at himself in the mirror without flinching. At 3 a.m, he sat at the small desk where he kept his notes, and he started writing. He wrote about what it felt like to discover that your entire life was built on fraud. He wrote about the moment of choice. He wrote about the consequences. He wrote about the cost. And as he wrote, something shifted inside him. The writing wasn't cathartic exactly, but it was necessary. It was the process of taking his pain and transforming it into something that might help someone else. 3 months later, Alessandro was called to testify before a prosecutor investigating his father's financial crimes. It was the first time he would have to stand in front of a court and publicly detail everything his father had done. It was the first time he would have to use his voice to destroy the last remnants of his family's reputation. The courtroom was cold and formal. The judge was a woman in her 60s with intelligent eyes and an expression that suggested she'd seen every kind of human depravity. The prosecutor was a man named Marco Benedetti who'd been building the case for 2 years. And in the gallery, watching everything, was Giulia. Alessandro testified for 6 hours. He detailed the shell companies. He explained the money laundering mechanisms. He described conversations with his father where Vittorio had explicitly discussed the fraudulent nature of various transactions. He handed over documents that proved the extent of the criminal enterprise. And with every word, he felt something happening inside him. He felt the last threads connecting him to his old identity being severed. He felt himself being transformed from the Marchetti heir into something else entirely. Someone new. Someone real. When he finished testifying, his mother was called to the stand. She'd been receiving psychiatric treatment, and her condition had improved enough that she was deemed competent to testify. She sat in the witness box and she answered questions about what she knew and what she'd deliberately chosen not to know. She cried. She admitted complicity. And when she looked at Alessandro, there was something in her eyes that was almost like recognition. Recognition that her son had done something she couldn't do. He'd chosen the truth. The sentence against Vittorio Marchetti was pronounced 1 week later. 8 years in prison, posthumously, merely as a matter of record. The sentence was read in absolute silence. When Alessandro walked out of the courthouse, Giulia was waiting for him. She said nothing. She simply took his hand. 20 years later, Alessandro received a letter from Diego Martinez, a Spanish banker who'd spent 40 years helping criminals hide money. Diego was dying and he wrote, "Thank you for showing me it was possible to choose differently." When Diego died, he left 600 million euros to organizations fighting financial fraud. All because he saw Alessandro choose the truth. At the end of his life, at 91 years old, Alessandro was in a hospital bed. Giulia held his hand. "Did I do it?" he asked. "You did," Giulia answered. "You transformed your pain into courage for other people." When Alessandro died, 500 people attended his funeral. Prosecutors, investigators, journalists, victims of financial fraud, children and grandchildren of people whose lives he'd saved simply by choosing to be real. Giulia published a book 5 years later. It became required reading in universities across Europe. It became the story of what happens when one person waits 30 years for another person to find the courage to choose truth. When she died at 97, the newspapers didn't call her an accomplice to fraud. They called her the woman who believed so deeply in truth that she sacrificed 3 decades of her own life waiting for someone brave enough to join her. So here's what I need to ask you in the comments section right now. Do you think Alessandro made the right choice? Do you think the cost was worth it? Do you think that one person's decision to choose truth can actually ripple outward and change entire systems? Or do you think it's just an individual sacrifice with no real impact? Rate this story from 0 to 10. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please subscribe now. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Because there are so many stories like this one. So many moments where ordinary people face impossible choices. So many moments where a single decision can transform everything. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.